I like to characterize myself as a cheerful pessimist. So I'm in America now, trying to put my money, time, efforts where my mouth is, working towards an ex-China battery supply chain. And there are opportunities in the domestic United States, and that is something that's worth spending one's life and spending one's time and spending one's money, not just advocating for, but making happen.
Welcome back to Rockstock Channel, and thanks for checking in. Before we launch into the interview, we'd like to thank all our Patreon sponsors. And for those of you who are new, share a bit about us. RK Equity is an advisory firm run by Rodney Hooper and me, Howard Klein. We are exclusively focused on raising awareness about companies producing or developing the next generation critical raw materials that are powering Tesla's EV battery energy transition. Please register your email at rkequity.com and follow Rodney and me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Please also subscribe to this channel, Rockstock Channel, on YouTube, as well as Lithium Ion Rocks on SoundCloud for our podcasts. Please note, Rodney and me are not financial advisors or broker-dealers. Nothing you hear in this video is investment advice. Please do your own research and read the disclaimer at the end of this video or on our website. Thanks again for the support, and let's get into the video. It's the 20th of December. We are going to have a wide-ranging conversation today covering a number of topics. We just had Chilean elections, so that is going to be topic number one. We can introduce Emily, who produced and co-hosted a podcast for a period of time, then launched the Minerals Manhattan Project podcast last year or so, focused on supply chains. And I think this is very much the year of the supply chain. So topic 3 is going to go into kind of, the USA. That'll be a major source of conversation. But given that Emily spent 10 or 11 years in Argentina, successfully building a few different businesses and becoming a bit of a Ms. Lithium expert, we haven't spoken a lot about Argentina on Rockstock Channel, and want to take the opportunity to assess, I guess, the politics, the economy, but also what I'm calling here the United Nations of Argentina Lithium, with China, Korea, USA, Australia, Japan, Russia, investing substantially in the past kind of few months.
Gabriel Boric, a 35-year-old former student activist who has taken the reins in Chile. I think that it's important to sort of take a look at how close the election was. Polling going into it, you had really almost split down the line between a very far right kind of Trump type Bolsonaro figure and a much softer, more socialist student leader type. And not only did Gabriel Boric win, he won with a decent enough majority to have some form of a mandate from the people. And even more encouragingly, his opponent conceded and hasn't tried to challenge the election. So it looks like Gabriel Boric has a mandate to lead. And so taking a look at sort of going beyond that idea of like, oh, someone who's far left is going to be anti-business, which is bad for lithium mindset. I think it's just more important to understand that President Boric is in favor of and will continue the process of the Constitutional Convention to rewrite Chile's constitution. And so what that means for lithium is, I would say, 2 things. Is sort of one, a bit more uncertainty. And then the second thing to kind of take a look at is, how important is lithium to Chile versus how important is Chile to lithium, right? So when you take a look at how important Chilean exports are to lithium supply, you've got a pretty substantial percentage there. But when you take a look at to how important is lithium to sort of the bottom line of Chile, you're at 1 or 2% of exports max, right? And so lithium in Chile is very much a politically charged topic that doesn't really move the needle from an economic standpoint. So I would watch the constitutional process that is going to be happening in Chile and understand that from a bottom line or looking at the numbers standpoint, if the leftist government needs to sort of make concessions from a populist standpoint, lithium becomes a much easier sacrificial lamb than something like copper, which is a lot more important for the economy.
If I can make an observation, like I've been a student of emerging markets for most of my career, in my early 50s, and the Washington Consensus, Chile was always a darling for the past kind of 30, 35 years, following what the IMF said. They privatized their pension system, and for a very, very long period of time, it relative to Argentina and most other countries in South America and in emerging markets globally, the political reforms and economic reforms were seemed to be very good from the perspective of Western investors and the like. And I was very surprised. It was about 2 years ago. This time, I was listening to podcasts with you, where Argentina was always a mess, post Macri it was a mess. But then all of a sudden, the pots and pans and the protests and the burning of subways, in Chile caught me very much by surprise. We're not used to seeing such political risk in Chile, and the constitutional changes that you're talking about, that transpired, after that, and then we've had some delays with COVID, I guess. But SQM is very much was a reflection of that Washington Consensus and the privatization. I mean, Boric has talked about, nationalizing lithium, and Julio Ponce, an oligarch billionaire, is, pretty much still in control of SQM. 3 years ago, you interviewed Eduardo Bertrand, right after they changed the tax policy and the royalty scheme for SQM and Albemarle, which in my opinion has incentivized SQM's very aggressive expansion, of low quality lithium. I haven't looked at how SQM is trading, yet today, as a result of this, but their concession ends in 2030. And, if Boric is talking about nationalization, I mean, this could impact supply of Chilean lithium, on a global basis in a market where we need every lithium unit we can get from all locations based on our demand forecasts.
I think it's a bit fresh to be called an emerging market for having protests from a country that literally had a armed storm the Capitol moment when we had an election, right? So I think a lot of the ideology that we're using to describe countries and describe people when it terms emerging versus unemerging, left versus right. I mean, I think that the left versus right, the Washington Consensus style thinking, like it's us, the capitalists, versus them, the, communists. I think that convenient worldview or tool to organize the world is a bit outdated, right? And this kind of follows up to this idea that you've got, people who are pro mining seem to be against the energy transition, right? And then people who are pro EVs seem to be anti-mining. The world is not as tidy and convenient as it was presented to a Cold War style situation. And so there's a very big difference, I think, between political models and economic models. And I think that what we're seeing to some extent in Chile, or what we're going to see in some extent when it comes to lithium, is blowback against this idea that a bunch of Chicago boys can come down into a country and fix the economy, right? One of the things I took away from talking to Eduardo Bertrand was that he was everybody's bad guy, right? That, he was trying to strike a balance, and from the markets and from the market standpoint and from the international standpoint, he was that bad guy who was trying to fight capitalism. And then from the more reform-minded folks in Chile, he was that bad guy trying to stop nationalization. And so, I think, I'll put my Santa hat on later and then take it off to Eduardo Bertrand for threading a very complicated needle for a long time. But to kind of take that over to a pivot to the Argentina question, nationalization versus not nationalization, what's the Constitution going to say about lithium? How is lithium going to be used, or how is it going to be represented in the political dialogue, is a lot more of sort of a soft soft science, right? This is going to be an emotional feelings driven situation rather than a right, this is what we should do. But when you talked about how the export taxes led to companies making a decision to produce and export a low quality product, I think that that is a more meaningful comparison with what's also happening in Argentina, because the additional export taxes or the while many of these taxes or many of these programs were put in place with the mindset of this is how we keep more value or encourage more value added lithium battery activities in these emerging markets. But the reality is that the companies that are producing lithium chemicals in these countries are much more inclined to produce a low quality product and add value somewhere else, or to, produce a concentrate and export it to get around export taxes or currency controls. And I think that that's an interesting comparison that your commentary kind of brings up.
I don't think that Eduardo Bertrano was not trying to do that, because he was very much advocating for
He was.
having higher value add, but in his attempts to take more from SQM, right? He had the taxes is slightly different on
take less
hydroxide
from Chile, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely, 100%. But he had a higher tax on hydroxide versus carbonate, but he didn't differentiate between battery grade and non-battery grade. So, if SQM tries really hard to make battery grade carbonate or hydroxide in-house, right, they get taxed extra because they're selling that higher value product. So it's complete. And he also said he increased their quota enormously, but he shortened the time frame only to 2030, which basically said produce as much as you can, as fast as you can, at the lowest quality possible. Companies are creatures of incentives, and I think that has a lot to do with SQM strategy. And SQM in general treats lithium as a commodity, as it treats iodine and potash as a commodity.
The politicization of lithium in the process of drafting and implementing a new constitution, this is going to be a easy choice for government officials who need to whip up a frenzy or get attention somewhere to go and to use. I mean, we talk a lot about how lithium is subject to volatility. I think that lithium in Chile will be subject to political volatility, where you'll see one group of people say one thing, change their mind the next day and say a totally different thing, and kind of use it as a tool to work out what's the next iteration of the Chilean economic model.
On to Argentina. Tell us what's happening from an inflation point of view, currency consideration, foreign direct investment point of view.
Listen, Argentina is a wonderful country, and it's simply, from an economic standpoint, it's a bit silly and illogical. Argentina is in the midpoint of a political cycle, so it's sort of 2 years in. There was a election recently, a congressional election, where, similar to the United States, it was kind of used as a referendum on the party in power. The Macri, or the Cambiemos coalition, did quite well in that election. From a monetary standpoint, I mean, Argentina is a disaster. It's in the point, as it's been for the last decade, of almost defaulting on IMF loans. It's in a position where you've got a parallel exchange rate that's 80 to 100%, close to double what the central bank says the currency is worth. And so I guess in a sense, it's business as usual. And what that means is that if you're a company or a group who's able to work within and stomach Argentine risk, there's upside. Argentina is also, from the lithium standpoint, sort of reaping the rewards, and I think can provide a good example to the United States of, during the last lithium boom, that coincided with sort of the president Mauricio Macri, Argentina turning a page, becoming getting Washington consensus-y, paying back defaults, etc. And that coincided with the last lithium boom. And so there was a lot of very high quality exploration that happened in lithium in Argentina. And so what that has led to is now in 2021, 2022, Argentina is one of the only countries in the world with a significant number, a decent handful, if you will, of shovel ready projects to build and produce lithium chemicals, where, one of the, I think we all agree here on this call, but one of the convos that I have with my gold friends is there's no such thing as the mother lode of lithium, right? The lithium is not a scarce element on the Earth's crust, but there is a dearth of knowledge, right? Scientific, both geological and then working out flow sheets of how to get lithium out of the ground and how to get it into lithium chemicals. And the amount of money and then the amount of time required to get projects ready to build exists. And Argentina is in a lucky situation where China's going shopping, Russia's going shopping, Korea's going shopping. The only mall, if you will, that has lithium projects ready to buy is Argentina. And so I think, I wrote a little note here, Howard, because you were talking about sort of can't remember the term that you used, but kind of a United Nations of Argentina lithium. And I'm gonna call them the Axis powers of Argentina lithium. I think when you put it out by dollar amounts, the dollar amounts that have been committed by China kind of nudge out the rest of the competition there a little bit. And I think that's because Chinese companies are going to be more deft at managing the illogical waves that are going to continue to be a reality of operating in Argentina, where you have currency restrictions that make it unclear whether or not you'll be able to repatriate. So Chinese companies are allowed to be a little more creative with their accounting, which I think will give them an advantage to operate in Argentina.
You're right. The dollars are big from China. So Zijin bought into Neolithium, $700 million cash. That's a new entrant of a Chinese state-owned, 24% controlled by the state, copper, gold, and zinc maker. So it's interesting. It's a new entrant to lithium. And then you have in Eramet, Xingshan, but they're earning in $300 or $400 million. And that's a DLE technology. And then we had just last week, POSCO going forward with their technology in Hombre Muerto. You had, a battle for, Ganfeng and CATL were going for Millennial, but Lithium Americas ultimately ended up with that. But Lithium Americas is 51% controlled, in Minera XR with Ganfeng. So I wonder if they, partner on Millennial.
China's initiatives in lithium has been to make low-cost, long-term financing available to companies in the battery supply chain, and that includes lithium. And what that does is it allows Chinese companies to operate at a lower cost of capital than its competitors, and lowering the cost of capital makes somebody more competitive. And it also it changes the time frame of delivery. If you look at a company who's not getting long-term low interest debt financing from the national bank, and then B, who's having to deliver a song and dance for a quarterly report, that company is going to make different decisions. They're going to be in a position to make different decisions. And I think that when you're able to take a more long-term look, Argentina's risks look more like waves that you can ride rather than something that's going to catastrophically impact your company's performance from one quarter to another. It becomes a livable, survivable nuisance rather than a nail in a coffin, I guess.
If I can touch on that, Emily, because you've said something and I'm thinking of it beyond Argentina. So if you look at the history of China and producing in chemicals, from permitting to completed construction is like a year in terms of conversion capacity, and most of the pricing is between $5,000 and $8,000 a ton. In the US, as you say, it's a song and dance and tears and a story, and 3 years later, and it's $25,000 to $30,000 if you can get it through. So the question is, yes, the DOE is looking at helping and assisting and funding, etc., but there's still a substantial gap between what it costs, aside from the time, it's the costs to produce. So the question is, who's to fund that? Because the DOE doesn't give out free loans, they just give low cost loans.
Yeah, they're not giving out many of those yet either.
Yeah, exactly. That's the hope. And then, does one set carbon taxes at an eye-watering level to try and balance the playing field? But then I think China will make some shifts on that front itself. Certainly in graphite, the guys are already moving to a hydropower province to do it, so that they'll also make the adjustments. So who picks up the check if you want domestic supply?
I think that's a very good question, Rodney. And I think that when we look at who picks up the check, it does come down to my more a worldview of, if we don't do something, we all are going to pick up the check, right? Is it going to be, do we pick up a check because we live in a China militarily and culturally dominated world in the next 50 years? That's one check that somebody's going to have to pick up further down the line. Or, simultaneously, do we all pick up a check for climate change and, get taken out by a tornado or an earthquake or some other catastrophic weather event? Or do, my kids pick up the check with their lungs and air pollution? Like, there are a lot of non-financial consequences that occur depending on what we do today. And not just the three of us on this podcast, but sort of the royal we, right? All of us. But I think when you look at comparing those costs, that said, right, when we look at comparing, so a $5,000 to $8,000 versus a $25,000 to $30,000, that's a big gap. And so I think that levering that, and I don't believe in an even playing field, right? Life is very unfair, and taking an approach of, whining, complaining, and being sad that life isn't fair is not a constructive approach to building the world that I would like to live in and leave for others to live in. And so taking that, why is it cheaper in China cost? You can take it down to, is it a cost of labor? Is it a cost of capital? Is it a cost of time, where your permits in other places just take a silly amount of time? Or is it a cost of this player is allowed to treat the environment in a way that somebody in a competing nation would not be allowed to treat the environment? And I think that breaking it down into and better understanding those categories is a way to look at picking them the check, both from a cost of capital and an availability of capital standpoint, to a consumer demand. Consumers are demanding more environmentally sound, less slave labor in the parts and in a supply chain. And you have to take the yes and approach to levering those costs. So bringing on board somebody like the Department of Energy to address the cost of capital and the timeframes, yes, that's definitely necessary. From a permitting standpoint, I think that the permitting reality for lithium and for battery related materials in the United States, it also touches an ego kind of thing, because most of the permitting processes in the United States, folks are used to saying, all right, I've permitted, 100 of these in my lifetime, I know this. The US doesn't have multiple permitted projects like this. And so in order for the US to learn how to do this, it takes what are they doing in other countries and how can we do that here approach, which Americans are not good at. They don't like to hear that they aren't the leader. They don't like to hear that they aren't at the forefront of some kind of a technological process. And then on top of that, US politics, I would say, look a lot more like Argentina's than Americans would like to talk about, where, maybe we work hard to make the permitting process more transparent, have shorter timelines at each stage of it. And then, we get a Trump presidency, and just because this happened under Joe Biden, it becomes, for big losers, and then we do something else, right? So I guess I'm not expecting to kind of go back to, I'm not expecting anybody to sort of pick up the check and level the playing field. But I am asking that folks along all portions of this, from the consumer standpoint to the investor standpoint to the government standpoint, try to understand better what the levers are that hold the US back from being competitive, and take a constructive approach to working on that together.
Because if you look at the economics of EVs and cut to the chase, you make about 6 or 7% on a car. That's what you make in operating margin as an OEM. So what I see everyone saying, oh, but lithium could do this, and it's only this much dollars per whatever. But the problem is all commodities often move in sync. So even if lithium does double, you chew 15 to 20% of the operating margin of a car. So the reality is everyone's saying, I want zero carbon, but I want it at China prices. So that's what we essentially is what's coming out of this mix. So I guess practically what we're seeing an even further pivoting, and it's in the numbers, despite all the rhetoric and all the talking, percentage of cathode produced in China, percentage of lithium, percentage of everything is skewing more and more to China. And you're seeing that in production numbers. Elon Musk, 18 months ago, whenever it was, said, no, we won't export from China. Now that's literally all he does. So we're seeing the reality, being very different from what people are claiming.
What people say they want, and then what people do with their money. There's a gap, right? And something's got to give. And the question is, do stated values and carbon footprint and environmental degradation give, or do that you can't say that you want something and then you can't put on a bumper sticker that's like, I don't like this type of practice, and then run down to H&M and buy t-shirts for $1, right? It's a cognitive dissonance, or it's simply not one is true. They both can't simultaneously be true.
We're in a very big bull market for lithium, right? And battery materials generally. Like the shift in the past 18 months has just been astonishing. And just looking at the backdrop of it, I'll just go through a litany, or a somewhat chronological, order. After the first couple of months of COVID, everyone saw the blue skies. There's the accelerated adoption of technology and electric cars and Tesla enthusiasm. But then you had Biden was elected, so that was a tailwind for the EV green agenda. Then the 2 Senate seats in Georgia going Democrat, so that was a further tailwind to the green agenda. Then you had the March stimulus. As soon as Biden came into power, I got whatever $5,000, $8,000 checks for myself and for my kids, which I didn't need, but it was a stimulus. The Fed has been stimulating. Then on battery materials, the White House had their 100-day review, so you saw a focus there. Then the COP26, America, was there in a way that they weren't under the Trump administration. The infrastructure deal was passed. The hope of the Build Back Better Biden Act and the hope of EV subsidies and charging infrastructure has been a tailwind all year to the overall thematic. And Jennifer Granholm has been an unbelievable spokeswoman for industrial policy in America from the platform of the Department of Energy. You've had, this reflected in lots of IPOs and SPACs in America from Rivian. Redwood is private, but they could easily raise a bunch of capital. But all of the SPACs, which we've talked about and followed, and all the major OEMs have announced, after Tesla Battery Day in September, you had Ford, 11.4 billion, plants in Tennessee and Kentucky, GM and Ultium, and now POSCO and GM on cathode. So massive commitments to battery factories in America like we haven't seen before, all on the backdrop, it's policy driven. A lot of this is policy driven. And then you have ESG and sustainability as an investment thematic has also been a huge tailwind. So all of these things are, coalescing to support demand for lithium battery materials. But you've had some headwinds, right? Progressively, and a lot of the politics impacts and the narrative shifts. So you had Afghanistan was not good for Biden. The delay in getting the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better Biden Act, and now Manchin, basically stopping it. Inflation worries, right? And meantime, and worries about the debt. Meanwhile, Russia is being aggressive in Ukraine, and their China worries, and Manchin kind of cited this. So there are some headwinds as we're ending the year and going into next year. Is it all super rosy, for lithium?
I like to characterize myself as a cheerful pessimist, in that, things are not usually great, but I like to try to have an okay time and do an okay job along the way. And, I'm not surprised. I am very unsurprised about Joe Manchin's decision to kill or maybe put back the Build Back Better deal, because, at the end of the day, American politics are very defined by folks who are making decisions about how to stay in power. And I don't judge them for that. That sucks, but that's the political reality that we've built in this country. And Joe Manchin, comes from the state that represents coal to the United States. And so, that guy I don't think he has the political capital to step over the aisle and support this, right? And while his decision to not support this bill does come from saying he's concerned about inflation and all of these things, I'm unsurprised, and that's fine. I would still be friends with Mr. Manchin, but I don't expect him to cross the aisle and get behind a Build Back Better policy agenda that is and should kill coal in America. Coal is a very antiquated form of energy. It's extremely dirty. While I'm not saying between today and tomorrow use absolutely no coal, from a policy standpoint, we should stop using coal for energy. It is not the optimum solution to this problem. And I don't think it's so much about folks losing their jobs. I think it's more about large companies losing a lot of money. So I'm in America now, trying to put my money and my time, efforts where my mouth is, in that there is an importance in creating or working towards an ex-China battery supply chain. And there are opportunities in the domestic United States to have lithium, particularly production and lithium chemical production, and that is something that's worth spending one's life and spending one's time and spending one's money not just advocating for, but making happen. Over the years since coming back to the US after a long time abroad, I've built a lithium exploration company called Luna Lithium around a very interesting brine project that came across my desk that's located in central Nevada. So it's been a very exciting time for sure. And it's really given me a lot of opportunities to understand better parties on both sides that have a lot of strong opinions on these topics. And being on the ground and handling permitting and understanding the challenges that both the companies and the folks whose job it is to permit these things are facing, right? These are, I have a little policy that I don't like to talk about problems. I like to talk about challenges, and really understanding, how do I get this from A to B or B to C when this doesn't have a defined series of actions that I'm allowed to take. It's kind of it's a belt and suspenders, and adopt a mindset of fortune favors the prepared, and give it a run. And it's, I think that one of the most striking things that I've found to sort of in spending a lot of time in a place that is really impacted by these things, right? I'm down the road from Albemarle, right? Silver Peak. This is Central Nevada, and Nevada in general is kind of lithium country USA. From, you and I talk a lot about the cognitive dissonance from the folks who want to have their cake and eat it too, from the folks who want a sustainably sourced green phone battery, but they want it at China prices. I'm getting to spend time in and live in a community that's kind of the opposite, where you've got these real pro mining folks. You've got a state that's 50%, I believe, of their revenue comes from mining, and yet that narrative is captured by gold and coal. So it's an interesting time to be alive, and I feel lucky to and up for the challenge of trying to build a really nice lithium project in Central Nevada.